In the year 1928, when George Hurt and Ruby King were married, Calvin Coolidge was president. The stock market crash that would start the Great Depression was still nearly a year away. Amelia Earhart successfully flew across the Atlantic. Mickey Mouse appeared in the Disney cartoon Steamboat Willie. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. The prohibition of alcohol was constitutional law, and Shirley Temple was born. George and Ruby started their life together in times Ruby referred to as horse and buggy days. They lived without running water and electricity in their house almost as long as they did with it. George and Ruby saw many changes in the world in their time. What did not change was their devotion to each other and their love for their family. Now the family they fostered has grown so large, the humble house George built would find it hard to hold them all. That wouldn't mean George and Ruby wouldn't want to try, though. George Duff Hurt was born in Van Dyke, just south of Paris, Tennessee, June 19, 1905, to Charles and Frances Hurt. He was the seventh of 8 children. George lived with his family in Van Dyke until he was 16. He quit school to help his father work because he was the oldest boy at home at the time. George told stories of learning to ride mules with the others on the farm. Charles Hurt eventually sold the Van Dyke place, and they moved to Birmingham, Alabama for about 6 months. In 1928, they came back to farm, and that's when George met Ruby. Ruby Mae King was born February 26, 1907, to Robert and Lenny King. She was the third of 14 children. George and Ruby met at a church now known as McDavid's Grove Baptist Church. They saw each other sometime in the summer in the Methodist Church parsonage in Big Sandy. A story goes Ruby's father didn't like George because he was trying to take his babysitter away. Ruby seems to be one of the main children who took care of her siblings. One Saturday night, when George came to court Ruby, Mr. King had piled wood railings in the driveway. George drove right over them in his horse-drawn buggy like they weren't there. Mr. King went in the house and slammed the door. George and Ruby were married that next Christmas. The first year of their marriage, George sharecropped. Ruby had told George she would not marry him unless he agreed to take Pauline, Ruby's sister, who was 20 years younger. Ruby was afraid Pauline wouldn't make it, because she was a baby when Ruby's mother died. George and Ruby lived with George's parents for many years.
It was a kind of a duplex, but Ma lived with her mother-in-law for years, so she had to be a good woman to put up with a mother-in-law, I'm sure.
For most of the first half of their marriage, George and Ruby lived without many modern conveniences.
My mother always told me times were hard for them because they didn't have much. Things that they had, they grew.
I remember them washing down at the spring, and they had to boil the clothes in a wash pot, then have to scrub them on the scrub board. We didn't have no electricity, and we got water from the spring.
We had to draw our own water for our meals and washing dishes, and Mama had heated on the stove.
On June 8, 1930, George and Ruby had their first child. They named him George Duff after his father, but for most of his life, he was called Junior.
Junior was fun-loving, and everything Junior did, it seemed like Mama got on him for something. He just laughed it off. He was fun-loving. I can still hear him laugh.
On October 24, 1935, Curtis Franklin was born.
Seems like he couldn't do anything wrong. Mama's boy.
Curtis, though the second child, felt a great responsibility to take care of the family, especially after Junior left the house. One day when George Sr. injured his leg badly while chopping wood, Curtis stayed at home with his younger brothers and sisters. He promised he'd cook them breakfast just like Mama's. Lenny would later say that the fried bologna was edible, but the biscuits and gravy the dogs wouldn't even eat. Curtis worried about his father that night, said he prayed, asking God not to let him die.
I thought he's going to die from the way he took on, I guess it really was painful. But Mama said, later said pain hurt Daddy worse than it did anybody else.
Much later, when Junior would pass away unexpectedly, Curtis would take on that responsibility of the oldest child outright. On April 5th, 1943, Lenny Francis was born, and from the very beginning she had a love for animals, especially cats.
I was a tomboy. I didn't want to come in from play, just wanted to run and jump and be outside.
Junior and Curtis, much older than Lenny, would inevitably go out on their own.
Curtis and Junior were older. They weren't even home at the time. And then, of course, Ronnie, he was younger, 3 years younger than me, and he and I fought like cats and dogs.
Ronnie Elvis Hunter, born October 31st, 1946, would be the final addition to the Hurt household.
His mother, Evelyn Palhagi, brought him down here. She couldn't take care of him and then left him with Mom and Dad for 2 or 3 months. And then when she came back to get him, well, Daddy and Mama had gotten attached to him. Evelyn had taken him over and he was supposed to go back that day. And then Daddy came home from work and he said he had to go get Ronnie. He couldn't let him go. So that was the extent of Ronnie leaving.
As a kid, Ronnie had a reputation as a hellraiser.
He was wild, threw things. Of course, Mama said the bigger guys put him up to it. Ronnie could do no wrong.
Throughout their lives, George and Ruby were anchored by their faith, and they shared it with their children daily.
I remember at nighttime, Daddy always read the Bible, read it to all of us. When supper was finished and he sat down and then he read us a scripture out of the Bible before we went to bed.
George worked 3 years for TVA in the early 40s. He would leave that job, again for farming. In 1947, George built the house himself that now stands in Springville. This would be the house he and Ruby would eventually retire to. George quit farming in 1950 to work as a carpenter. In 1951, Junior enlisted in the Army to fight in the Korean War. He left his home in Tennessee to go to basic training. Afterwards, he would then ship overseas to Korea and war. During his time in basic training, Junior would go to places he had never seen before, meet people from all over the country. Dear Aunt Queenie, got your letter last week. It was good to hear from you. Proud of that pamphlet you sent me. Got a letter from Ann today. I'll probably get to eat some of that chicken in about 4 weeks. I've got 3 more weeks of training. Then I'll probably get about 15 days before I go overseas. It'd take about a day and a half to get home. I'm listening to a preacher over the radio. Last week we was under artillery fire. Me and some more guys was in a ditch. The guy that was laying on the ground in front of me got a piece of shrapnel in the side of his head between his right eye and ear. Knocked a hole about the size of a $50. He jumped up and hollered, fell over on his back and passed out. They took him to the hospital. They had to take his right eye out and they're afraid he's going to lose his left eye. He's in bad shape. And his wife's going to have a baby and they have her allotment messed up because he was 2 payments behind on his house. We passed the hat around and gave $3 apiece. He got $300. That'll help him out. I want you to pray for him. Pieces of it hit all around me, but I guess I was lucky. Well, be good and ride soon. Love, Junior. Junior would have gone to fight in the Korean War, if not for a mix-up with his shot records and then a case of the mumps.
He came home on leave and he got mumps, and then he went back, and of course that was when he was supposed to ship out. Curtis then came down with the mumps. I think Curtis came home with them and gave them to him. That was why he didn't ship out.
Junior never went to Korea, never saw battle. Starting in 1953, the Hurt family would move to Atlanta, where George would work as a contractor.
Dad needed work. Of course, Alton had promised him if he moved to Atlanta, there would be all the work he could do. Think that they only went down there because they had to.
George and Ruby would stay in Atlanta until 1970. The children, still in the house, would finish their childhoods there.
As you know, then I was getting to be a teenager, and I did like Atlanta.
By the time George and Ruby moved back to Springville, all their kids were grown up, and most of them had children of their own.
Junior, I guess I can remember when we used to get together in the kitchen. Me and him would sit down after everybody else gone to bed, and we had a few drinks, and his favorite liquor was Charterhouse. We would have a few drinks and tell a few tales, and so me and him, we enjoyed each other. When Lenny got divorced and I was divorced too, we spent quite a bit of time together. And Ronnie, I used to take him to see his girlfriend and leave him, and then I'd go back and pick him up, and then me and him played basketball.
All the kids were grown, and George was retiring. George and Ruby would return to Springville, to the house that George had built, and that's where they would stay.
Mom and him were really happy over there. You know, they had 2 bedrooms and a bath, and of course, and then running water, electricity. Yeah, they just about had everything.
All of George and Ruby's children would go on to start families of their own. They made grandchildren. Those grandchildren gave them great-grandchildren. And many of those great-grandchildren are creating George and Ruby's great-great-grandchildren. In 1905, when George was born, the U.S. population was 83,822,000. When Ruby died in 1995, the population was 261,638,000. In the time that George and Ruby were alive, the United States fought in World War I and II, wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. There were 17 presidents, from Theodore Roosevelt to Bill Clinton. Communism swept through Russia and Eastern Europe, challenged the West, and then left. George and Ruby saw the age of radio, the age of television, and the beginning of the age of computers and the internet. As the world changed around them, they took the little bit that they started with and grew it with love, faith, and hard work. Now there are many who can look back and trace their bloodline to the humble, loving couple from Springville, Tennessee. Some of us have their stubbornness. Some of us take their hospitality. Some their dedication to family. Others the hard work ethic, maybe the love of animals. Many still hold their deep faith. Regardless, anyone who claims a place in the Hurt line owes a great deal to George and Ruby Hurt.
I guess that's about it, ain't it?